We'll have Phil Brannen. He's a plant pathologist with the University of Georgia, and he'll be talking with you about phony peach.
Hey, I don't know, y'all, we need to dim the lights a little bit, or is that good? I think you got it. All right. So I am going to be talking to you about phony peach, and this work is certainly a lot of work of a graduate student, but there's several people I'll mention at the end as well. But this has been a pretty interesting project for us, and hopefully you'll find this an interesting presentation as well. The reason we started working on phony peach was around 2015, we had quite a few growers in Georgia had come to us and said that they were seeing more of this, or they felt like they were seeing more of it. So we had a brief meeting in 2015, September 23rd, and went out and looked with several of the extension folks and some of the growers and looked at some trees and started thinking about what we could do. Then we had a follow-up meeting, which we decided to actually make some action items, try to look at this a little bit more closely. If you look at this, you can see this tree here in the foreground. That's a phony peach tree right there. You can see a healthy tree in the background. One of the things you can actually see here that was not reported until we started working on this, and we now report this as a new symptom, it's probably not new, it's just never reported, is that discoloration of that tree. And that's something you're not going to find anywhere in the literature, historically or otherwise, but you will now, just because of this work that we've done. So the question arises, was phony peach getting worse, especially related to possibly warmer winter temperatures? We know a few things about the bacteria. We thought that could be a possibility. So that was the question that we came up with. And then the secondary question is, if phony peach is getting worse, then what do we do about it? So, it's one thing if it's getting worse, but we'd like to have some action items that come from that. Now, one of the things we did was to review the literature. And you can find this paper. This is a review article that my graduate student, Clive Bach, and I worked on pretty extensively. We reviewed the literature very, very closely. Now, one of the things, if you go back and look at Rump, was the guy who actually has, developed the Alberta peach that kind of launched a lot of the peach industry in Georgia. You look at the date on that, that's around 1870. He's also the first man to report phony peach in 1885. So within a 15-year period, he saw it on 2 trees. That's where it started. And so it's probably elsewhere as well, but he started out looking at it. So that gives you some idea of how long it's been around, and it really developed into a major problem in the first probably 30 to 40 years of the industry. If you look at that person also who established the Alberta, again, this is Rump, there he is right there, but again, he observed it, reported it near Marshallville, Georgia, and I'd still say that Marshallville was probably ground zero for phony peach today. It's caused by a bacterium, the Xylella fastidiosa. It's a subspecies multiplex. You don't need to know that, but there are different types of Xylellas that are out there. The glassy winged sharpshooter is probably the primary vector. There are others that are out there as well, and we don't have that many management options, and I'll talk to you about that in a little bit as well. Again, if you look at this bacterium, it's a gram-negative bacteria. But the thing that you need to know about is where does it live? It stays in the xylem of the plant. So it's basically the plumbing is where it lives. And that's the only place it's going to be found, is in that insect and in the xylem of the plant. Very, very specific. As I mentioned, there are other diseases also that are caused by Xylella, but these are, in one case, this is a different subspecies. This is the Petri, or Pierce's disease, I should say, of grape. And you can see that scorch impact on the leaves there. This is the scorch on blueberry. This is a different subspecies. This is also multiplex, but maybe a slightly different bacteria that occurs on peach. But what you'll notice is these are scorch symptoms. Virtually all of the Xylella diseases are scorching type diseases. They're clogging the xylem. Tyloses are being produced in that xylem also that cause the moisture or water not to be able to go to the top of the plant. You're going to get scorched, and eventually the plant will die, generally pretty rapidly within a year to 2 years. But this is what phony peach starts looking like. So you start out with this kind of an odd thing where it's a very squat kind of a plant, shortened internodes, and you can see that it's a much more dense canopy. That's a classic phony peach tree. They used to be described as being darker, and they generally are early on because the leaves are so compact. But this is what happens over time. And you don't see a lot of reference to this in the literature because I guess for 100 years we've killed every phony peach tree we could find, and you don't get this kind of advanced symptoms showing up. but you get these kind of antlers almost coming out from the limbs that you can see with a phony peach tree. And also not reported in the literature, these trees do die. Now, whether you can say they're directly killed by phony peach or a secondary death, but they do die, so they don't last forever. And then this kind of a bronzing type leaf effect is something that we're reporting here too, and that's generally pretty consistent. As the trees develop over time, and phony peach develops over time, later in the season you can actually tell a phony peach tree not just by that squat nature of it, but also the coloration. In a lot of different varieties you're going to see that bronzing look on the leaves. You can also see early development of a phony peach tree in the spring. It blooms out ahead of the other trees. There's some type of a hormonal response or something that's going on there. We don't understand what that is, but it does actually produce a bloom earlier, and you can see that with that particular tree compared to the others around it, which are normal trees. Now, I've already mentioned Rump, and he had the Alberta peach. Alberta was his wife, but it was his first wife. So Hale was also one of the pioneers in our peach industry. He didn't make that mistake. He just named his first peach after himself. And so he didn't have to worry about getting a divorce to figure out what was going to happen with that name later. But he was a huge influence on the peach industry. And if you look at some of his fruit trees he was putting out, and he had production, but he also had a lot of nursery stock as well. But these are just a wealth of information. This is one of his photos from one of his brochures, and each of those rows is a mile long, and that's in Georgia. We don't see that kind of production very much anymore, but very, very obviously an important figure at the time. So in 1915, he kind of got the whole research program on phony peach going. So it had been taken off as a disease, but I'll just kind of read what he said sent off to USDA at that time, or what would become USDA. He said, as you know, Georgia has been quite seriously troubled in recent years with what someone has called phony trees in our peach orchards. Trees with darker green foliage than any others in the orchards, very little new tip growth, a moderate set of fruit, which never grows to full size. Going over the orchards of this district just now, I discovered that this disease is spreading rapidly. There are tens of thousands of trees so affected as to be of no commercial value in the future. It appears to be the most serious menace to the industry that we have ever had here, although I doubt it is fully understood at the present time, and that's in 1915. He just gave a very good description of the symptoms of phony peach. If I were to do it myself, I wouldn't do it any better. But he said it was a major problem. Well, shortly after that, USDA actually started a program to survey phony peach. I'll show you some of that information in a minute as well. But they also started an eradication program. So they're trying to get as many phony peach trees out as quickly as they could, because it did appear to be spreading. And one of the guys with USDA that was in charge of this effort at the time, by 1933, said over 1 million trees have been pulled up in 3 years, and many growers had been forced out of the industry. So this was a significant disease. It was bad enough at that time that people were actually losing their livelihood and losing their farms over it, and so it was a significant problem. So this question, going back to our recent questions we had, this one comes up also. Is the range of phony peach increasing? If the warming winter temperatures are having an effect, we should see the range increase. So we ask a question secondary to that: where is phony peach currently found as opposed to the historical range? And this is actually pretty interesting. So if you go to some of the original maps, this is very early on. This is from 1928. Prior to the 1929s when the survey actually started, but they were already mapping some of the areas where phony peach was found. And you can see here's Fort Valley and Marshallville, again, what I would call ground zero for phony peach, probably for several reasons. But they could tell that that was a very, very intense area, and they could look at other parts in Georgia and see it was there. That didn't give us a whole lot of information. But by 1933, this map was drawn. And this is from Hutchins in 1933, joint effort between USDA and Georgia entomologists at the time. And the thing I want you to be careful about, this is a broad brushstroke kind of a map. You got to remember, these guys were running around in some vehicles that weren't probably that dependable, if they even had vehicles. They couldn't cover all this area. So keep that in mind. There's just no way you could do that. But they did a good job of showing where it was really intense. You can see this area right here in Georgia and Alabama. It's intense. And then this area that is outside of that, pretty significant phony peach presence. And anything that is in this lightly infested, we don't even really know what that means, but it probably means that people saw it and it was there. Okay, so that's what it really was. No way to get beyond that. And then by 1959, you don't see a whole lot different. It really hadn't spread anymore. This is kind of the last historical map that we have, and one of the last times anybody had looked at it in that way. But you can see kind of what the range of that disease was. Now, if you look at historical states where you've had this, this is showing everywhere that phony peach was reported. The thing I want you to note here is there's some pretty far north states that had phony peach, and some of them had enough that it was considered a problem. The furthest west we have is actually more recent, and this particular site, this is in Arizona or New Mexico. Which is that? Get it mixed up. I guess it's New Mexico. But anyhow, there were 2 trees there. That was it, and they killed them. Okay, so don't worry about that too much. The thing that's really kind of confusing is California. With all the peach trees that have been grown in California, there has not been any report of phony peach ever, historically or now. And so that's still kind of an oddball type fact. In the current states, based on surveys we've conducted recently, these are the current states that actually have phony peach. And again, I've already mentioned this far west one. That's not even there anymore, so just discount that. So really, for all practical purposes, Texas is as far west as it goes. And then if you look at where is it really a problem, it's very much a problem in the southeast, and it's limited again to this area. So what changed? Why do we have these historic maps where you see phony peach all the way up into the north? Pretty extensive, dramatic type reasoning as far as where it was. Well, we do know some things about it. We've looked at, with Clive Bach in particular, looked at kind of mapping where phony peach was historically and also where it is now. And what we have determined, at least in the southeast, and you can't necessarily draw this line across the entire country and say it's going to hold true, but in the southeast at least, the 34 parallel is kind of a demarcation line. When you get above that, you don't have much phony peach. When you get below it, it starts to really build up. Okay, so that's could be related to quite a few things, but temperature could be one of them. If you look at peach production going back historically in Georgia, this is kind of where we maxed out peach production, somewhere around the mid-1920s. And from there, it's pretty precipitous that we went down. Now, phony peach was part of the problem there, but there were other things too, like San Jose scale and other things that started to come in, make it really tough to produce peaches. Plus, we just probably overproduced a lot of peaches as well. But that gives you a map and kind of give our graph and gives you some idea of when we peaked with peach production. Well, we've got these maps we can develop from the historical data as well, and this is just looking at peach production during that time frame. This is from 1924, this is from 1929. And when you look at the number of acres of peaches in Georgia, I don't know where we are now, but let's say we're somewhere around 10,000 acres. Let's say that's where we are today, or maybe more than that, but not much more than that. And you see we had about 150,000 acres at one point. When you go up here and look in the northwest part of the state, which I don't even think we have peach production up there hardly at all now, but in those areas, there were anywhere from 5,000 to 4,000 acres of peaches just there. So you had significant peach production pretty much all the way into North Georgia. So keep that in mind. Now, again, Clive did this work to look at just some of the things that are associated with where we found phony peach historically. And this is looking at 1929 and 1930 data. And what he found was that latitude, where you are north to south, elevation, also going north to south because of the mountains, and then the temperatures in particular were significant. If you look at these p-values over here, they're very, very significant. So that says that something about going south to north is going to decrease phony peach. That's basically what that says. And in both years of that historical data, that was the case. So looking here, there are a lot of things that change as you go from south to north. We get into different types of vegetation. We go from a coastal plain to our fall line to our Piedmont. You can see that. Again, this is that historical data to show you where the peach production was, but clearly above this line, there was still a lot of peach production. So it wasn't the fact that we didn't have a lot of peaches that meant we didn't have a lot of phony peach. That's what I'm trying to get you to understand. And then when you look at where it really was, and this is looking at 1929, again, you go below that 34th parallel, there's just not much, and it's obviously diminishing as it moves further north. Here's another couple of maps. This is that 1929 compared to a 1930 map. And when you look at this, you can kind of see, and this is percent infected trees per county, you can again very clearly see that the further south you go, the worse it is. And this is based on actual counts at that time. Now keep in mind that had to be the peak of the epidemic because trees had not been removed before. So you had all these trees that were just out there basically spreading or allowing the spread of the bacteria everywhere. And so this is the peak. So it tells you where phony peach can really be bad. So the question arises is why was there not that much phony peach up here in North Georgia? But then when you look at some of these historical maps, you can see that they had phony peach all the way up in here. And I think there's probably several reasons for that and a reason why it's basically retreated back to kind of its native range. Well, if you look at where the trees were coming from at that time, we now get all of our trees from Tennessee, or the vast majority of them for commercial production in the southeast are coming out of Tennessee. At the time that phony peach was really blossoming and blowing up, most of the nurseries were in middle Georgia. We had as many as 20 large nurseries in middle Georgia. There were nurseries in Florida. So a lot of this peach production in the southeast and even going further north, the nurseries were providing that material from that area. So you're planting little baby trees, and this is from Tennessee today, and very similar production. Everything was exactly the same 100 years ago that we're doing now for peach tree production. And we had, again, this is just a couple of the examples, but you had Hale and Rump both had their own nurseries, and were selling trees everywhere. But you see how tight that is. You can see that those little baby trees with a lot of glassy winged sharpshooters running around and injecting bacteria, you could inject a lot of trees with a lot of bacteria and then send it out. It takes 18 months at least before you can see the symptoms of phony peach. So therefore, it's going to take you maybe 2 to 3 years before you really see it. And so by shipping all these peaches all over the southeast and further north, I think that's how those maps got to be as big as they were and as far ranging as they were initially. Once the eradication program went into place, a lot of the phony peach was eradicated from northern states, or it just died out naturally. There was indications that trees would show phony peach but never spread. Again, that's representative of taking a plant, planting it in a place where the environment's not good for spread, and it eventually dies. And so we think that's what's happened. We speculate, and I say we speculate, but it's pretty good speculation that's why this was like it was. So that kind of explains why the maps were so much broader back in the 100 years ago than they are now. One of the other questions that comes up, and we found this historical data, we always get these questions of, do we remove these trees? Is it important to remove the trees? And in order to remove phony peach trees, obviously it takes effort to do that, and it's difficult to do. But the question is, what good does it really do? And so you have to do really large-scale studies if you're going to answer that question. Well, these were some large-scale, these is just side-by-side type studies, but these were done back in the 40s and early 50s. And on the right over here, what you're seeing here is where they do not remove phony peach trees. And you can see how quickly over time the percentage of trees with phony peach goes up. Here's where you're removing trees, and you can see how stable that is. Now, anecdotally, that's the same thing we see today. Where producers are not removing trees, we see phony peach go through the roof. Where producers are removing trees, we don't see it spread that much. Again, there's not great research data on this to back it up, but that is a very good trial right here, at least to look at, even if it's a side-by-side comparison. If you look at what we would call the disease pyramid, in this case for phony peach, there's several things that go into that. You got to have the bacteria. You got to have time and exposure of vectors and the bacteria to the plant. The environment has to be good. You got to have a good host, in which peach is actually an excellent host, and you got to have an active vector population. If you don't have any of these things, you're not going to have disease, or you're not going to have much disease. Okay, so what we think is that when we go to middle Georgia, and this was even reported back 100 years ago, there were people who reported in the literature There's something special about Middle Georgia and phony peach. We don't even know what it is. It's probably a combination of the hosts that are around the peach trees, combination of the environment, the bacteria, the insects, everything is there to make that disease really prevalent in that area. Now, this is very complicated. I'm not going to go through this life cycle here with you, but I do want to talk to you about the things that are in there that are important for us to know for control. What are the things you can do to control phony peach? Well, basically, you can get rid of all those symptomatic trees. I just mentioned I think that is important. I believe that. Planting PPD-free nursery material. So if you don't have phony peach material coming in, you're not going to have phony peaches. The Tennessee nurseries probably have helped us a lot in the sense they're just far enough north, they probably don't have a whole lot of potential for infection, and that's good. So that helps us from that end. If you get rid of the alternative host around the peach orchard, that's also going to be important, especially wild plums. We know they are very good host for phony peach. But that's also difficult to do. It's not something that's easily done. Something we have not tried a lot, but we probably could, and we do know it could have an impact, is vector management. So if we had especially drip applied imidacloprid through the drip tape or drip line, it does work much more effectively than any foliar applied insecticides. So that's something we probably ought to look at as one more thing to consider over time. So the question, is phony peach getting worse? The answer is, I don't know, but I don't think so. I don't think it's substantially worse. I'll put it that way. I think it could be possibly a little bit worse because of warmer winters, but we don't see that much there. Can we improve detection so we can get trees out better? This is another thing our graduate student had worked with as well. And this is somewhat practical and somewhat interesting information. We're going to try to improve upon training in the future because of this. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but Hutchins, same guy who had reported how many trees are being out and kind of in charge of this program back 100 years ago, he said that he could train somebody to be 98% accurate in identifying phony peach trees. I don't think that is possible. I think he believed it. Either that or it's the Depression, he wanted to make sure everybody kept their jobs. But nonetheless, I'm not sure you can do that. We've looked at this, and where we have looked at taking inexperienced people we have trained versus experienced people, and by experienced people I'm saying Chin and myself and Clive and some others who we think we know what phony peach looks like. And then we train people in one day, and then we go out into orchards and we do runs of orchards to identify phony peach and see what we come up with. Well, if you look at the inexperienced, which are kind of in this yellow dot, versus the experienced, and this is time of day and different varieties that we're in. But what you want to see here is, of course, the experienced are going to be more accurate than the inexperienced on that day. That's what you would expect. It just shows that training can make a big difference. If you know what you're looking for, it is going to help. And one day of training may not be enough. You're going to have somebody with you, walking with you, looking at trees in order to make that work. If you look at the estimated phony peach incidence versus actual. So here is the actual. If you look at this red dot in these orchards and at these times, this is what the actual level of phony peach was, and we know that based on PCR. If you look again here at the experienced versus the inexperienced are getting a lot closer to that, but none of us are hitting it perfect. That means we're making mistakes in identifying phony peach. If you look at the false positive versus false negative rates, these are also kind of interesting. False positive, it doesn't matter whether you're experienced or not, you're going to make mistakes. That means you're saying it is phony peach when it's really not. It may be armillaria, it may be some other reason the tree's being stunted, but you're going to have false positives out there. With training, though, the false negatives can go way down. Again, if you look at the green, the experienced raters, we do a much better job of figuring out of not doing the false negative. So a false negative will be you say it's not phony peach when it really is. So at least we're doing a better job with that. So training is going to make a difference in what you're identifying and accurately taking out. Now, out of this work, we've got quite a few publications that have come out already and some new ones that are coming out. One of the things, I know y'all probably won't be as excited about it, but we got the first whole sequence of this Xylella out of a peach tree. And when I say we got it out of a peach tree, there's a gentleman out in California who actually took all the DNA and figured out what was Xylella DNA and actually sequenced it. So that's the first sequence of that. And that's going to be important going forward for additional work. So what are our conclusions? Number one, this disease is still prevalent in Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Florida. Historically documented states do not have it. A lot of these states just don't have it where it used to be, and we think we know why now. Visual assessments can be improved. We can see that, and we need to work on that. That's something we can work on. Disease distribution and patterns within PPD sampled orchards does indicate aggregation. Again, that's just new information. I didn't show you any of that data, but it's stuff that never was done. We're looking at imaging type stuff, but none of the imaging type stuff that we're doing is any better than what we get with just looking at it with our eyes. So far, that does not, taking a drone and going over with the camera, so far has not helped us out. We do now know, based on that genetic work that was done, that yes, indeed, the plum strain is the same as the peach strain. We thought that to be the case. We start to actually tie that down and say, yes, it is. We've looked at several other things to spray on the tree to try to help alleviate the symptoms or reduce the symptoms. None of that has worked. Nothing like that has ever worked in the past, and it doesn't seem to be working now, but we may be able to look at some other things. As far as future work, we're going to go back and review seed transmission and budwood transmission. That has been looked at in the past, but we have different techniques to make sure we're doing it right. And we want to look at several other types of studies. And I won't go through all of these, but there are quite a few other things that we can do. I already mentioned vector management as being a possibility. I think marker-assisted breeding or even GMOs could be something we could look at in the future. And so there are quite a few other things that we need to do as we move forward. So our biggest thing for take home, the path forward I see, is that we're going to have breeding or rootstocks that are going to solve this. We can do everything that we're doing right now, and we can continue to produce peaches in the southeast and in Georgia. But if we really want to get rid of phony peach and actually not have it, I think this is probably the way forward. We've got to do something different than we're doing. Spraying is not going to get us out of this, although we can try that as well. And vector management can only go so far. You're going to get resistance to insecticides over time. With that, I'd like to acknowledge all the people who worked on this project. In particular, Kendall, my graduate student, you see Chin over here as well, and Clive Bach, Glenn Raines, Paul Severns, and then the gentleman out in California, J.C. Chin, who actually sequenced the first phony peach strain genetic sequence. Okay, leave you one more thing. Why is it important to understand this disease? This is actually trees in Italy that are dying from a different strain of Xylella. We don't have that strain here yet. We hope we don't get it. But that particular strain does go to plum in South America. So we are not through with this battle yet. I mean, there can be another strain that we bring it in that would be bad for us on a lot of different levels. So we don't have it here in the United States. Don't know what it would do here. But nonetheless, we need to keep doing this research. Okay. I'm probably out of time, I think, on my time, but yes.
Comment. In South Carolina, there is it's a non-funded law that DPI will monitor and test and pay for the removal of phony trees.
It's still
It's still on the books.
okay.
But there's no money.
That's the way a lot of things are.
And I remember, Gavin Berry was in the Saluda office, and we would go out quite often. And of course, there is an active monitoring of budget lots.
Yes.
And it's time Simon Scott would do that.
Right.
As another note, I detected a block with Schuler's in Santee. He had about a 4-acre block, and we detected 8 trees that were infected. And of course, to adequately control, you have to assume that the trees adjoining it are infected but not showing symptoms, but are still able to transmit. So to remove one tree, you actually need to remove 5 to control. And that is why it's persistent.
Yeah, well, it is. And you're right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't, and it'd be so with something we've not done. I guess we haven't looked at surrounding trees to see what percentage of ones that have it with PCR have it. We haven't done that. Yeah.
You look at pigweed.
Yeah.
Species.
Yep.
Adjoining cropland, just go into the whole thing about resistant pigweeds and the resurgence of that. Weeds that are in some areas of at least my former area or closely adjacent to peach trees.
And some of the weeds are definitely reservoirs for the bacteria. And so keeping a weed-free strip and then also mowing everything down is important. So, and there's some that we definitely know. Sorghum grass and some of those types of grasses are definitely going to harbor it. Yes?
I was just going to add that I've lost 2 orchards to PHONY because of hurricanes. And the PHONY is rising from, I'm thinking, from the root system of the tree, because we just had one that in 2017 when we had bad hurricane come through our area. Out of 4,600 and something trees, 2,200 and something was blown over. We set them back up and, propped them. And since 2017, we have probably lost every one of those trees to PHONY that were propped up.
Look, there could be a stress relationship between a tree that's already stressed and an interaction with the bacteria, but I don't know that for sure. But what you're telling me would say that maybe there could be. I'm not sure.
I don't know if groups of common species, have root rot
Yes,
that could transmit from an infected tree
it can happen.
to a non-infected.
It does happen.
That would bypass the sharpshooter.
Yes, it would. Yeah,
These
yeah.
trees went PHONY from after, because they were exceptionally healthy trees, but after the hurricane twisted them and whatever it did to them, we set them up. Over time, every one of them died, came down PHONY, and we had to take them out.
All right. I probably need to cut it off because I don't want to take Norm's time. All right, you good? And I'll be glad. I'm going to be here. Y'all can talk to me or question me after this is over. I'm going to pull Norm's up here too. All right, thank you.